bring up.
Thank you, Cliff, and thanks to all for joining us today. I should say that that this event is the outgrowth of 3 weeks that I spent in Israel this summer. It was a longer period of time. Generally, I'll go for 5 or 6 or perhaps even 10 days, and that feels like a lot. But I had the opportunity to actually sit and talk with people over a longer period of time. And what I walked away with was rather fascinating. And then as I'm sort of mulling over what I've learned, Gaith and I had an opportunity to sit down over coffee, and the conversation that we had I thought was fascinating. And so we thought that this could be something, after the Iran deal died down, that we could bring to a Washington audience. The conversations that I had in Israel, I kept coming back to a movie from the 1980s. I kept thinking about the movie Trading Places. I don't know if anybody remembers that movie with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy, where you have this sort of multi-millionaire who all of a sudden finds himself down on his luck, and then this common criminal who's elevated to the point of a multi-millionaire. And this is, I think, the way that a lot of Israelis were looking at their position in the world. That not so long ago they were, America's best ally in the Middle East, and all of a sudden had no idea how they had fallen so far and how difficult it was for them to navigate these treacherous waters. And so, and one of the response though is I think the thing that was fascinating to me. And in the movie, you had this. The Dan Aykroyd character resorted to crime, and ultimately, you saw this deep decline, and he's openly struggling with his challenges. In Israel, you almost got a sense they just didn't want to talk about it at all. A fascinating little anecdote is that in the 3 weeks leading up to the JCPOA, as I'm looking at the newspapers every day, there were 3 headlines dealing with the Iran deal. You compare that to the way that we dealt with this here in the U.S., and it's remarkable. Every day the Iran deal was splashed all over the papers. There were battles on Twitter and Facebook. In Israel, they almost didn't want to talk about it at all. And so I found that fascinating. And the thing that I heard over and over again is that it's extremely difficult for Israelis to claim that they are now in a strategic relationship with the United States. That if you are looking at a deal that provides Iran the ability to end the arms embargo in 5 years and the ballistic missile ban in 8, and that they have a legitimized industrial nuclear program in 10 to 12 years, how can you call this a strategic relationship with Israel? Now, I heard from military and intelligence types that they supported the deal. Not because they thought it was a wonderful thing for Israel long term, but that from their perspective, the Israeli military realm, they try to look at 3 or 5 or perhaps even 8-year horizons, and they try to think about war planning. And for Israel to have the Iran conflict off of its plate for perhaps 3 to 8 years, or perhaps longer, that is it's a treat. For the Israelis. It means they only, and I'll put that in air quotes, they only have to deal with Hamas, Hezbollah, and other asymmetrical threats. They don't need to deal with the Iranian one. And so what I heard from some Israelis is they're wondering have they returned to the 48 to 67 era, right? When the United States was an ally to Israel, but not the ally, not the primary ally. And it was an era when the Israelis were looking for common interests among other states. I think about the 1956 Sinai campaign, where they're working with the Brits and the French on areas of common interests and angering the U.S. You could find yourself in a position now where the Israelis are looking for it, and if anybody saw the article by Shmuel Rosner in the New York Times recently, they're openly asking, is it time to find new allies? I'm not sure they're there, but it was fascinating for me to hear this discussion, to hear people openly pondering this at this moment. It reminded me a little bit of the sort of Bedouin tradition that I learned about in graduate school, where you had Bedouin families sending their young kids out into the desert to see if they could survive in this harsh climate. The difference, of course, is that Israel's not a young nation. We're looking at Israel as sort of a maybe on the cusp of maturity, and they're being thrust out into this harsh climate. And so anyway, I mean, the bottom line is it feels like in a very important moment for Israel. And I heard this from everyone who I talked to, that identity is changing. An interesting thing that I note is that religiosity is on the rise in Israel in ways that we've not seen before. There is a new Judaism that is sprouting up in Jerusalem. It used to be that only Orthodoxy was the only kind of Judaism that one could talk about, that there are now new strands of modern Orthodox and even conservatism. And in general, what you see is traditionally secular Israelis are trending toward religiosity. There was a piece that came out yesterday saying that over 60% of Israelis celebrated Yom Kippur. That's interesting in and of itself. I mean, I remember as a young graduate student living in Jerusalem, and it was a day where everybody would be out on a bike, that's what Yom Kippur was for, and that only the religious would go. And now you've got more and more people, over half of Israelis, taking this holiday very seriously. On top of that, you've got more indigenous Israelis. 28% are from Sephardi origins, 37% are from Israeli parents. So in other words, they're second generation Israelis. That means that 65% of Israelis are now of Middle Eastern origin, which is, again, also significant. And what this means is that Israel is more Middle Eastern than it ever has been. And of course, this flies in the face of those who would try to detract from Israel, saying that it's a colonialist country. But it does echo the lament of President Obama, who was talking about how this is no longer the Israel of Golda Meir. It is. It feels very different, and I think Israelis can acknowledge that themselves. Ironically, even though Israel is becoming more Middle Eastern, you get a sense that there is a deep desire to insulate itself from the Middle East. And of course, that's the result of the rise of Iran's influence in the region, the rise of ISIS, the threats from Hezbollah and Hamas. And so even as they try to insulate themselves from these threats, you also see Israelis take great pride in their global integration as the so-called startup nation. And so this is why Israel takes such great offense at what we call the BDS movement, or the delegitimization movement against the Israelis. And even, I mean, the Israelis take this so seriously that we even now have a new ministry dealing with this threat, that the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, one of their primary portfolios is trying to deal with this issue of delegitimization because they take this so seriously. And so all of these factors, compounded by the turmoil of the Middle East as a result of the Arab Spring, the big questions about U.S. ties, the trajectory of Iran, has pushed Israel to the right. There is no question about this. There is little interest in the peace process. That, of course, is not a surprise to anybody in this room. But what's interesting to me is that when you talk to Israelis, they say, look, this actually probably has very little to do with recent events, that this is something that dates back to the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005, that it was clear then, as it is now, that there is no interlocutor on the Palestinian side that they can take seriously. And so you have this sense that we've reached a point of stagnation, the strengthening of the right, the institutionalization of the right in Israel. And we see that with the rise of people like Naftali Bennett. But what's interesting is that you also see the relative decline of people like Avigdor Lieberman, and the rise of people like Yair Lapid, who's a centrist, I suppose is probably the best way to put it. And so, I mean, I think the sense that I walked away with was that Israel's not quite ready to relinquish its liberal its liberal roots. That it's sort of obviously, you know, where Israel's trending right now in terms of the way that they look at their at the threats from around the region and the need to lurch to the right, but they're not quite ready to go there and to commit to it long term. And so I think this is essentially a summary of what I learned while I was there. that the Obama administration has certainly pushed Israel in certain directions, that the changes that are taking place around the region, and now the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has all thrown Israel into an era of renewed uncertainty while all of these other changes are taking place. And so it's for that reason that Gaith and I thought this might be an interesting discussion, and I'll let Gaith talk about what's happening on the Palestinian side.